Irish research in Pennsylvania is some of the most challenging research you're going to take on as a genealogist. It's so challenging that I decided to reach out to the experts at the Ulster Historical Foundation in Ireland to help us figure out how to research our Irish ancestors. There's so much information that they gave me. I divided it over 2 episodes. So this is episode 1. Be sure to check out episode 2 next week. We're going to cover the 5 misconceptions / mistakes that people make when they're doing Irish genealogy research. I'm Denise Allen with PAAncestors.com, and if you're just getting started with Irish research or you've been at it for a while and got stuck, this episode is for you. Be sure to check out all the show notes because there's lots of links in there. Our experts, Fintan Mullan, Gillian Hunt, and William Roulston, all cover when and where you'd want to access those resources. You're going to want to take notes throughout this episode. You're probably going to want to listen to it a couple times. I'm really excited because this is going to help you get your Irish research done. The Ulster Historical Foundation is running online Irish genealogy research courses. This is a wonderful opportunity to get this knowledge and consult with these experts about your family. It starts next week in February, so check out the link, see if it works for you to sign up. Whether your ancestors were Irish, Scots-Irish, they came in the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s, this episode is going to help you with that research. Let's get going. I wanted to welcome all of you from the Ulster Historical Foundation. I had the privilege of attending one of your workshops in the Philadelphia area, and I just would love if you could share with the people listening who you are and the work that you do, because it's really great and perfect for people that live in Pennsylvania or have Pennsylvania ancestors.
I'm Gillian Hunt, and I'm the research officer with the foundation.
I'm William Roulston, and I'm the research director with the foundation.
And I'm Fintan Mullan, and I'm the executive director of the foundation. Just to give you a quick overview, the foundation is now over 60 years old. Denise, established in 1956, opened for business in 1957. In the first 30 years of its existence, we were part of the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. So your listeners may know that's the state archive in the northern part of the island of Ireland. And then we separated in the late 1980s and became a standalone educational non-profit, and we are a registered charity as well. And because of that 60-year pedigree, we actually are involved in quite a lot of activities. So we started life tracing family history for overseas clients back in the 1950s. We started publishing in the 1960s. We developed a membership society that's worldwide. It's called the Guild in the 1970s. And we began also then at the height of what were the Northern Ireland's worst period of troubles for violence. We started bringing visitors to Northern Ireland to research their ancestors themselves in the archives. In the 1980s, we got into digital technology. We started transcribing and creating these databases that came together about 15 years ago in the Roots Ireland website, where all the centres in Ireland joined together to put this website together. And we've continued to develop the range of sources and services from the foundation ever since, primarily serving a family history orientated audience, and largely but not exclusively overseas. So the North American genealogists would be a significant part of our market. And we continue to publish books, and we continue to try to deliver research in these difficult times, but with the archives being closed, that's extremely difficult. And our programs where we bring visitors to Belfast to undertake research for themselves, they obviously have been hit. We had to cancel 3 programs this year, the June, September and October programs, but we have started experimenting with a virtual course that we started running in November, and that is actually going very well. We're very pleased with how that's going. So we'll be looking to do more of that in 2021, as we all hope with our fingers crossed that we'll turn a corner in this situation and the vaccines will allow us to get back to some sort of life. So the foundation is a multifaceted organization. I want to say we're not just a family history society. We're not just a publisher. We have these different aspects of the work we do. And it's all to help anyone irrespective of their experience or background, to find out more about the 9-county province of Ulster and their family's place within it.
Through the technology of DNA testing, I think it's easy for those of us in America to find out if we have any Ulster ancestry. There's some very specific genes that we've carried through. I know I have some, and then I found the names later, which was kind of interesting. But you have given me this great list, and I want to run through it. The number one thing that you put on this list of misconceptions is that when people start Irish research, they think it's pointless because all the records were destroyed. Can you speak about that? I mean, I know your program gets into everything that exists, so we can't cover all that for people. But why do people think that everything was destroyed?
Well, this is one of the thorniest old problems we have, because it's getting on now for nearly 100 years that this sort of myth has existed. And it goes back to the start of the beginning of the Irish Civil War, which there's a number of factors. It's to do with the separation of the island of Ireland from the United Kingdom to become a separate independent state. And that doesn't happen. You have partitioning of the island of Ireland, which is planned, the creation of a new state in Northern Ireland, and the creation of an Irish Free State. And there's those who accept that as a sort of reality that they just have to live with, and those who refuse to accept it, and they say they want a 32-county completely independent country, as was imagined in the 1916 Rising and the Proclamation. And so the political fallout of this comes to a head in June 1922 at the start of the Irish Civil War. And it's important for family historians because the key focus is the Four Courts building in Dublin, which is the principal law courts of the land on the north bank of the River Liffey. And that is where the old Public Record Office of Ireland was housed. So the record treasury, where the actual ancient documents themselves were housed, were held in that building. So when the Irish Civil War starts, the anti-treaty forces, those who refused to accept the treaty with the British, the new Irish Free State, they're installed in that building and have been there from around about Easter of 1922. And so they're in the building, and the British government bring pressure to bear on the new fledgling provisional government, Irish Free State government, to evict these anti-treaty insurgents. And so a bombardment starts. Explosives hit or shells land. There's explosives and munitions in the building anyway because of the insurgents. Bang, the record treasury goes up in flames, and millions of documents get burned. And anybody who's ever watched films like Michael Collins will see examples of, you see that in various films, historic films that have been made. And so because of that action, it was blackest day in Irish family history. We lost millions of documents. The problem is everybody thinks absolutely everything is destroyed. So what we would do in presentations is just draw the attention to some of the major sources that family historians would normally expect to see. So for example, census records, and our census returns from 1821 through to 1851 were completely destroyed in the Four Courts fire in 1822. A very large proportion of the Church of Ireland, that's the Anglican or Episcopal Church in Ireland, the Church of Ireland lost some 60% of their earliest parish registers for just over 1,000 parishes on the island of Ireland. Their records were destroyed, and they were destroyed. They were in the building because up until around 1869, 1870, it was the established church, the state church. And so the records from that period were considered to be state records, public records, and therefore the rectors were asked to deposit their registers in the Four Courts, i.e. in the Public Record Office. We lost practically all of our pre-1900 wills and testamentary records, although some records survive in copy form. And we lost millions of other very early sources, some medieval records, that family historians would have drawn on to trace their family history. So it was a major loss, but the myth has grown that absolutely everything was burned. So we have to constantly challenge this, because of course not everything was burned, where there was a major loss of records and some massive collections, the obvious ones, for example, like census. So much material has survived, and a lot of cases it survived, we would point this out to people, because it wasn't in the building in the first place. So the records of the Catholic Church or some of the other Protestant denominations like Presbyterian Church, Methodist, they weren't public records, so they weren't in the building. The records of civil births, marriages and deaths, valuation records, and records held in Dublin Castle, so the Chief Secretary's office, his papers weren't, and other collections held in Dublin Castle went there. You had the Registry of Deeds, the records in a completely separate building, and that archive dates from 1708. And you have other collections, for example, the landed estate records, which were held by the big estate owners in their estate offices, and they were not, of course, in the Four Courts building to be burned in 1922. So you have a huge loss of records, but there's so much else that survived. And the other thing that we would constantly point out to people is, while the originals may have been burned in 1922, there are, in some instances, copies of those records, and we use the copies that have survived rather than the original sources.
To pick up something on what Fintan was saying, that since 1922 and the destruction of the record office in Dublin, archivists have been working very hard to identify additional records and substitutes for the records that were destroyed. So if you take the Public Record Office in Belfast, one of its great strengths is the fact that it combines both official government records with private records. So Prony is the official archive for records relating to the government of Northern Ireland. So it has cabinet papers and departmental records, but it also has a very large collection of private records, such as records of the churches, for instance. And Prony was very active in going out, identifying church records, bringing them in, copying them, or microfilming and making them available. And likewise with the landed estate collections, Prony archivists were very much involved in going out to the big houses, the descendants of these great estates, identifying important collections of records and bringing those into the archive and sorting them. And likewise, in other archives in Ireland as well, the National Library and National Archives, they've also been active in identifying new, well, not so much new material, but material that was not in the archive in Dublin in 1922, and bringing those records in and making them available to researchers.
We do rely on this country a lot on those census records because they're digitized, they're indexed by the, on the computer. And we do think that if we can't use that, then we're lost. That's like our main guidepost. But
absolutely.
But when you use these additional records, these private records, that's where you get some of the richness about your ancestors, some details that you wouldn't get through sort of that main path.
And there's other census substitutes we would use, 19th century ones like Griffith's Valuation and Tithe books. And those are valuation records, so they will only list sort of the head of household, who's paying the particular tax. So they're not as complete as census, but they're really useful in helping people identify, where those surnames were found or where their ancestors were in a particular time. So at least that's some sort of substitute for those census, because as you say, that is for many people that the census returns are the way in to genealogy. So without those, it can be a little bit overwhelming to therefore think, well, how do I research ancestors in a country that doesn't have any 19th century census? The other thing I would say about the fire is there's a great project at the minute called Beyond 2022. I don't know if you've come across this. The website is beyond2022.ie. It's work done by the National Archives of Ireland, Public Record Office Northern Ireland, Trinity College Dublin, and National Archives in Kew in London. And they have created this wonderful website where they're kind of creating like a virtual public record office as it would have been in 1922, and you can kind of virtually walk through into this search room, and it actually, like, I've seen some of the kind of early testing of it, and it's pretty impressive what they've been able to do. And they've also created the actual like bookshelves, and what they've been doing is they're looking in different archives trying to find, as Fintan mentioned, those copies or those extracts of records and putting them kind of virtually back into the Public Record Office. And it's really exciting because they've actually found, I mean, they're never going to find, all those census returns just copied somewhere like that, but they actually have found some really interesting documents in those archives that, replacing some of the things that were lost. And they're also doing really exciting work with what they call the burnt documents. So there were some documents that were held in a safe in the reading room, so they weren't completely destroyed. They were damaged, but they weren't completely destroyed. And very fortunately, 100 years ago, the archivists knew they did not have the technology to work with them, so they just catalogued them and left them as they were. And now 100 years later, they have the technology and they're actually like peeling them back, and they're actually able to, you can see some of these documents, because actually once they unrolled them, the inner bits weren't as damaged by the fire. So that's really exciting, because that's almost documents we thought we'd lost that, you know, we're now able to get some access to. So that's a really interesting development for anyone who's interested in what the Public Record Office would have looked like 100 years ago. Check out that website. They're going to be adding to it over the next couple of years. So that's a really exciting development, I think, in this kind of sad story of the 1922 fire that we talk about a lot in Irish genealogy.
As soon as I'm done this interview, I'm going to go check out that website. I love things where I get to experience the life of my ancestors. I said the other day, I wish I could be on a boat, you know, in the 1700s, making that crossing just to experience, like if there was a virtual reality version, because I couldn't do it for real. But
you don't want the real version of it.
Yeah.
I suppose the other thing we'd say about this whole loss, everything was burned, is people can make generalized statements, but whatever genealogists need to do is get down to the minutiae of what has survived. Because for 99%, maybe everything has been burned, but for your family, you could be one of the lucky ones, and you could be very pleasantly surprised what you can find. And the ingenuity of archivists and family historians in the last 100 years in trying to make up the loss is one of the success stories of Irish family history. Absolutely. Archivists, historians, and genealogists, and some of them American genealogists, have brought to the wider research public these unusual sources that they've unearthed from places, for example, like the Chief Secretary's office in Dublin Castle, because that was obviously a private archive of the British, of the British government in Ireland. So well, that is a blackest day. On the plus side for researchers, the point to bear in mind, how do we mitigate this, is that so much alternative material, to a certain extent, I mean, you do have to qualify it, but a certain extent, alternative material has been unearthed, and family historians can piece their family history together. And our organization is proof of that, because we have been doing this for over 60 years for clients overseas.
And the other thing I would say is that actually a lot of Irish records are available freely. And I think that is a kind of consequence of the government knowing how much was lost, you know, so the census was made available for free, and some of the historic birth, marriage and death certificates are available. So that's also kind of benefit for anyone who's researching their Irish or Scots-Irish genealogy.
We love free. Okay. Yeah. So the number 2 misconception was researchers only look at the records for the period of which their ancestors were in Ireland. So what is the big deal about that? Why do I need to look at more records or a wider time period?
Well, I mean, it's an absolutely understandable assumption to begin with. Like, why would you look at records after your ancestors had left Ireland? It doesn't seemingly make any sense. The first thing I would say is that it's unlikely that the entire wider family emigrated. So even if the whole immediate family, you know, has left, you may find siblings or cousins and their children and their descendants remain in Ireland. And so it would be their records that you could find in later documents. So that's something that can help you, particularly if maybe you don't know exactly where your family came from, to be able to look at some later, more comprehensive documents that have full listings of surnames. Then that can help you begin to identify and narrow down where your own family may come from. Things like the 1901-1911 census, for many people, their ancestors left, you know, years, if not centuries before that census. But actually, I still recommend it as a source for you to look at, partly as kind of that any of those free indexes to kind of surname search, anything like that, to get a sense of where your surname might be found, but also because it shows you the religious denomination, and that can be really helpful. Now, of course, there's lots of surnames in Ireland that belong to all the main religions, but there are some surnames in Ireland that would have been more strongly associated with one denomination or the other. And just putting your surname into the 1901 and 1911 census might help you begin to identify what church records you should be looking for. So I was working with a client last year, and her family, she was from Australia, her family were Roman Catholic. But when I looked in the 1901-1911 census, and her family had emigrated before that point, I discovered that everyone of that surname in Ireland was Protestant. So I sort of wrote back to it and said, we might need to just look in Catholic records, but also Protestant records, because this is what I'm finding in the Irish records. And she did a bit more digging in Australia and discovered that her grandfather had actually converted and became Roman Catholic in Australia. So actually over here we need to look in Protestant records. So things like that, like 1901, 1911 census, for people, you might think, oh, there's no point. But actually that kind of sense of helping you drill down to the religious denomination, drill down to the geographical area in Ireland where your family might have come from is really helpful. And also those other records I mentioned earlier, Griffith's valuation, which is from late 1840s to early 1860s, and then the earlier tithe valuation from the 1820s to 1830s. Again, even if they post-date your ancestors' immigration, they can still be used, put in your ancestral surname and begin to get a sense of where that surname was found, because some surnames in Ireland are quite site-specific in Ireland. You'll find them just in one or two counties, or even maybe more specific within a county, and that's really, really helpful. So for example, when I'm working with clients whose ancestors left in the 1700s, if the client maybe doesn't know where in Ireland they come from, I will still check the tithe book or the Griffiths valuation to get a sense of, okay, these are the parishes in this county where your surname was found in the 1820s. So let's begin by looking at church records in those parishes, you know, and then that just allows them to begin to filter, to sort of narrow down where their search might be usefully led. And then within the landed estate papers, there are some rentals, some lease books that might post-date your ancestors' immigration, but in those documents, they might actually include information from earlier leases that do cover the period when your ancestors still lived in Ireland. And some of those earlier leases might not have survived. So it's only in these later estate documents that you have the information of the names of the tenants and the details. So yeah, absolutely. It does seem kind of counterintuitive, but some of those later documents might first of all have earlier information in them, or else might just help you in terms of identifying where your family came from.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, that totally makes sense. And you're reminding me too of doing the research completely on the family that I do know where I am, you know, before I cross over, because the woman finding out that her was a great grandfather converted. Yeah, that's a key fact.
Yeah, and absolutely, as much as you can in your country first. And I always recommend to make sure you're not just researching your direct ancestor, but any siblings who also emigrate. Because, for example, I had one client, his ancestor only ever wrote Ireland on the census in America, of course, very frustrating. But I found that he had a younger brother who survived to the next census towards the end of the 1800s. And he, in his last census, wrote specifically where he came from in Ireland. So yeah, again, when you're doing your own country's research, make sure you're looking at all the siblings, because it might just be in one of their records. You know, a death certificate mentions the parents' names, the mother's maiden name, whereas your own direct ancestors' death record maybe doesn't. So yeah, absolutely, just explore as much as you can in your own country as well.
And as well as siblings, if your new family moved to America with people from their neighborhood, it's also worthwhile checking into those families. It is said, you know, I think it was Oliver McDonough said they moved from one village community in Ireland to another village community on the other side of the ocean. And that village community might have been in the Bronx or, you know, Brooklyn, not necessarily out in the sticks. And you may have a very common name, so you may have Murphy, but your neighbour who went with you may be McGladdery or some much more unusual surname, which maybe will spike better in the records when you're going through those lists. And as Gillian says, all those sources, because they've become digitized now, there are virtual, you know, effectively signposts for us to say, well, where can I find the surname I'm interested in 1901 or 1840 or 1831 or 1766? So they're all little clues to sort of point in the direction. This is perhaps where I should be focusing my effort.
Consider pursuing family members who emigrated to another part of the world, whether it was Australia or New Zealand or Britain, because sometimes the records in those countries can provide fuller information on your ancestors and the broader family circle. For example, my great-great-grandfather's brother emigrated to Australia, and when I found his Australian death certificate, it was able to tell me when he was born, where he was born. It told me who he got married to, when he got married, where he got married, when he arrived in Australia. It told me who he married, the names of his children, when he died, where he was buried, and more. So from one Australian death certificate, I was able to find out more about his life in Ireland than from Irish records.
Wow. I have... Okay, now I'm excited about those Australian connections that I have for my one surname. I'm gonna, okay. This
And
is
those
great.
Australian records of immigration also contain the sort of detail that William alluded to there. And other family members who are already living in Australia can be referred to. So you have other points to reference as well as your own direct line.
Yeah, definitely explore those Australian cousins. Absolutely.
We've gone through 2, and you've already given me more research to do during this quarantine than I can possibly get done. This is fantastic. Okay, so, you pointed at this one already, but that the Irish location recorded in American records is definitely where the ancestors came from. That's your number 3. So people deceived people about where exactly they were from. And were like some parts of Ireland more appealing than others to put in an American record?
Not that we would have typically found, but I mean, of course, for some people it just says Ireland. But if you have been able to find a specific place, maybe it's on an immigration record, maybe it's on some other record, of course, that could be the place of birth. That could be the thing we've always been searching for, but still be a little bit cautious. What we find is sometimes it's the place of departure, where they've left Ireland from. Sometimes it might be the nearest kind of big town or city, rather than put their specific little townland. It's well, people will have heard of Belfast. I mean, I do that myself. I come from a little town about 10 miles outside of Belfast, but when people ask me when I'm away from home, I'm not going to say Carryduff, I'm going to say Belfast, because people will have heard of that. And that, people would have done that in the past as well. Now, of course, both of those, the place of departure and the big town or city, they at least give you still an area in Ireland on which to focus your research. But sometimes we find that people become, absolutely convinced that their ancestor was from Cork, whereas that may have just been where they left from, and they were from somewhere in the southwest of Ireland. So that's just something we would say, just be very broad-minded, keep an open mind about where they came from. And remember too that a lot of place names in Ireland are named to describe the physical description of the area. So for example, Derry means oak wood, and a lot of Ireland was wooded. So there's a lot of places in Ireland called Derry. And if you see that written down, you might assume it's the well-known now city of Derry, Londonderry. But actually, there are many, many, many townlands called Derry across the place. So that's where you would use a combination of some of those other indexes that I was mentioning, the tithe books, Griffith's valuation, any of those free indexes really, put in your surname and make sure that the area you think your family came from actually has your surname in that area. Like I say, some surnames are specific to areas. So, there's no point you assuming you're from the northwest of Ireland when your surname is very much associated with Cork and Kerry. So there may be a place called Derry somewhere in those counties. So that's just what you need to be a little bit cautious of. Not that people were purposely deceiving, but just that maybe you're assuming, that it's the most well-known place. So I was doing research very recently, and the family came from Newcastle, County Down. Now there's a town where the Mountains of Mourne are. There's a well-known kind of coastal seaside resort called Newcastle in County Down, but they actually came from the Ards Peninsula, a little townland just outside Portaferry called Newcastle. So it's that kind of assumption that's a very easy mistake to make, and it just shows you how important it is to try and get to grips with the geography of Ireland as well as the history of Ireland.
So now we're doing geography, history.
Absolutely.
I'm so glad you gave me a bunch of links to put in the show notes so people can start educating themselves.
And don't forget, Denise, also, which is a common problem always, is errors in transcription. So the place in Ireland has been incorrectly transcribed, just as the surname might be incorrectly written down by, an immigration agent or, landing in Castle Gardens or whatever, but they may also have mistranscribed the place name, and one letter could make a major difference. Like Port Stewart is in County Londonderry, but Fort Stewart is in County Donegal. So it's simple little errors like that could throw people off the trail. And archaic spellings of your ancestor left in 1780 as opposed to 1890. The how they described where they came from might differ, and certainly in the spelling. We have, in terms of our townlands, we have over 60,000 townland names in Ireland. So there's lots of Derrys and Ballys and Tullys and Drums to be mindful of when you're looking.
The fact is that the same place name could refer to a number of different administrative units. So for example, you've got the city of Armagh, the ecclesiastical capital of Ireland, The city of Armagh is in the parish of Armagh, which is within the barony of Armagh, which is within County Armagh. There's also the Archdiocese of Armagh. You've got the Poor Law Union of Armagh. So you've got the same word used for many different administrative units. Gillian mentioned Derry, Londonderry. Well, there's obviously the city with that name, but there's also the county as well.
Yeah, that's very true. You don't always know if they mean the settlement or the county, or, as William said, any of those geographical divisions. So I think we gave you that list of resources. There's a number of kind of place name websites on that, just to help people understand the geography a bit more. Fintan, did you want to highlight any particular?
There's two we would refer to: placenamesni.org, which covers the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, and then the Luganium website, which is from the Ordnance Survey of Ireland, which does the similar job for the 26 counties of the Irish Republic. And there's a degree of overlap between them. And the Luganium, the Ordnance Survey in particular of Ireland, have a number of new digitized digital resources available. And you could link through also to, for example, both on the Ordnance Survey website and on the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland website, the historic map viewers. And it's good for your listeners or viewers who maybe haven't looked at many Irish maps before. Ireland is a wonderfully mapped country and historically has been. It's one of the best mapped parts of Western Europe, and there's historically reasons for that, but we're just lucky that has been so. So if your viewers and listeners haven't seen these before, they should go on and have a look at something like Prony's Historic Map Viewer or Place Names NI, because you'll get a wonderful sense for the richness, the diversity, but a sense of the spatial, the spread, how it looks on the ground. And you can do wonderful things with these online resources. And again, as Gillian said, nearly all of them are free as well.
Oh, wonderful. And also getting from what you just all shared about the place names is, don't panic if I get conflicting information across a family, because one could be describing the parish versus the county versus the closest town. And so Absolutely. Just collect the information. Don't try to make one right and one wrong, and, just go running with one. I want to thank Gillian, Fintan, and William once again for sharing all this information with us. It was really great. It was a fun interview, as you could probably tell. So, have you researched an ancestor in early Pennsylvania that was Irish or Scots-Irish? Leave a comment, leave it in the review of the episode on the audio podcast. I'd love to hear, did you find everything you could about this person? Did you figure out when they arrived in America? Did you figure out their parents and their siblings and actually make that trip back over the Atlantic Ocean back to Ireland? Hit that subscribe button, whether you're on a podcast player or on YouTube, and that way you'll get the next episode automatically downloaded so you don't forget about it next week if you get busy. And if you would like to subscribe to my newsletter, where I update people weekly on tips and resources for Pennsylvania research, not just on the Irish, but for anyone who has lived in Pennsylvania during any time period, go to my website, paancestors.com. The link's in the show notes, and you'll get a pop-up there for the newsletter where you can subscribe. And that also comes with the free research guide, 10 pages on how to get started strong in your Pennsylvania research. And I look forward to hearing your discoveries of your Pennsylvania ancestors.